It all started on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. My teenage son had just come back from basketball practice, tired but in good spirits, when we heard a knock at the door that changed everything. Standing outside were two police officers, looking tense and serious, saying they were called by the HOA. They claimed there had been suspicious activity involving my son, though he had done nothing more than walk home in his gym clothes. At first, I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding, maybe a mistake that could be cleared up in a few minutes. But the way the officers kept looking past me, scanning the house, told me this was more than just a routine visit. You see, what the HOA didn't know was that inside our home were two family friends, former Navy SEALs who happened to be staying with us for a few days. They were calm, disciplined, and trained to notice things that others might miss. From the moment the officers stepped onto the porch, the atmosphere shifted. My son stood frozen behind me, confused and scared, while the tension in the air grew thicker by the second. The HOA's complaint, which sounded harmless at first, suddenly felt like something much bigger was at play. The SEALs didn't move or say a word, but I could sense their eyes following every detail, the stance of the officers, the tone in their voices, the way one of them kept reaching for his radio. My son whispered, "Mom, what's happening?" And I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation at the door. And just as I was about to speak, one of the officers stepped forward. And that's when everything changed. The officer who stepped forward had a clipped tone, almost rehearsed, as he explained that the HOA had reported disturbances coming from our property. He didn't go into detail, but the way he spoke felt less like a request and more like an accusation. My teenage son shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting, as if he was being blamed for something he didn't even understand. I wanted to defend him right away, but I could feel the two Navy SEALs behind me watching closely, signaling me with their calm presence not to rush into anything. They knew when situations like this could escalate if handled carelessly. I kept thinking about the HOA. Why would they involve the police over my son? He had never caused any trouble, no loud music, no arguments, no vandalism. He was a good kid, respectful and hardworking. But the HOA had a reputation for overstepping boundaries, always searching for reasons to flex their authority. This time, though, it felt personal. And with law enforcement now standing in my doorway, it was clear they wanted more than just to hand out a warning. As the officer continued asking questions, I noticed subtle things. His partner kept glancing toward the windows, like he was looking for movement inside. One of the SEALs shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to sense he was preparing for whatever might come next. My son whispered again, "Mom, did I do something wrong?" And my heart broke, because I could hear the fear in his voice. I knew I had to stay calm, but the unease only grew. This wasn't about a simple complaint anymore. It felt like the start of something larger. And then the officer asked a question that made my stomach drop. The officer leaned closer and asked if anyone else was inside the house. It seemed like a simple question, but the way he asked it carried weight. My son looked at me, waiting for me to answer, but I hesitated. Something about the tone made me wonder if they already knew the answer, or thought they did. Before I could speak, one of the SEALs shifted in the hallway, his presence almost invisible yet steady, like a shadow that had been waiting for this very moment. I tried to play it calm, telling the officer that family friends were visiting, nothing unusual. But the flicker in his eyes told me that wasn't enough. Why was the HOA so determined to escalate a harmless situation into something that required police at our door? It didn't make sense. Unless, of course, there was more going on behind the scenes, something we hadn't been told. Meanwhile, my son kept whispering questions under his breath, trying to understand why he was suddenly the target of suspicion. To him, this wasn't just about the HOA or the officers. It was about trust. He couldn't understand why adults who were supposed to protect and guide were making him feel like a criminal in his own home. That fear was starting to weigh on him, and I could see his confidence shrinking. From the other side, I could feel the quiet discipline of the SEALs. They weren't here to cause trouble, but their instincts told them this encounter wasn't random. They had spent years analyzing threats, reading body language, and preparing for the unexpected. And the more they observed, the more it felt like something about this visit wasn't adding up. Then the officer's radio crackled, and both policemen stiffened, as if they'd just received new instructions. That's when the room seemed to grow colder. The radio call was short, just a burst of static followed by a clipped message, but it was enough to change the energy on the porch. Both officers exchanged a quick look, and suddenly their posture shifted. One of them placed his hand on the edge of his belt, not in an obvious threat, but in a way that said they were ready for something more serious. My son stepped closer to me, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked if they were going to take him away. I squeezed his shoulder to reassure him, though deep down, I wasn't sure what was coming next. Behind me, I felt the steady presence of the Navy SEALs. They hadn't spoken a word, but their silence carried weight. I could almost sense the calculation happening in their minds, assessing exits, reading the officer's body language, preparing for every possible outcome. They weren't here to fight, but their instincts told them this was no ordinary HOA complaint. The officers asked to step inside, saying they needed to verify the situation. The request hung in the air like a test. My son's eyes widened, fear flickering across his face, while my pulse quickened. Letting them in meant opening our entire world to suspicion, but refusing might only escalate the tension. I could see one officer tapping his radio again, waiting for a response that never came. The SEALs shifted just enough for me to know they were ready if things went wrong. They didn't need to say anything, their calm control was louder than words. Still, the air felt heavy, like we were standing on the edge of something about to break. And just as I opened my mouth to answer the officers, a loud knock thundered from the back door. The knock at the back door echoed through the house like a warning, sharp and deliberate, not the kind of sound a neighbor would make. Both officers froze for a second, glancing at each other as if they hadn't expected anyone else to be involved. My son clung to my arm, whispering that he didn't understand what was happening. Neither did I, but my gut told me this wasn't just about the HOA anymore. One of the Navy SEALs moved silently toward the hallway, his steps controlled, his eyes sharp. He didn't need instructions. He was already reading the situation, aware that whoever was at the back door had timed it with precision. The second SEAL stayed close, watching the officers carefully. Their calmness was almost unsettling, like they had trained their whole lives for moments exactly like this. The police, however, looked rattled. One officer called something into his radio, his voice lower than before, and the other tried to shift his stance to block me from moving toward the kitchen. It was clear now that they knew more than they were letting on. But why? What could possibly be so serious that both the HOA and law enforcement were involved in such a strange, coordinated way? The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of someone trying the handle. My son's breathing grew quick, and I could feel the fear radiating off him. The SEAL near the hallway raised a hand subtly, signaling me to stay calm while he edged closer to the back door. The tension was unbearable, the kind that makes every second stretch longer than it should. And then, without warning, the back door creaked open, and a shadow stepped inside. The moment the shadow stepped into the house, everything seemed to happen at once. The SEAL closest to the hallway moved forward with lightning speed, his voice calm but firm as he ordered the figure to stop. The officers spun around, clearly startled, their hands hovering near their radios as though this wasn't part of their plan. My son gripped my hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear, but I knew he was watching something he'd never forget. The intruder froze in the doorway, and as the light fell across his face, I realized it wasn't a stranger at all. It was the HOA president. He looked flustered, caught completely off guard by the sight of two Navy SEALs standing inside our home. He stammered something about needing to check for violations, but even the officers seemed uncomfortable with the excuse. It became clear then that the complaint about my son was never really about him. It was a pretext to get into the house. But the question lingered. Why? One of the SEALs stepped closer, his presence commanding the room without aggression. He calmly asked the HOA president to explain himself, and under the pressure of all those eyes, the man's voice cracked. He admitted he had suspected illegal gatherings, but offered no proof, no reason for dragging police into it. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing they had been pulled into something far outside proper procedure. Just when I thought the truth had fully surfaced, the second seal leaned closer to me and whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "This wasn't about the hoe at all," he said quietly. "Someone wanted to know who was staying in your house." And in that instant, I realized the real story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The words from the seal hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said that night. The whole president shifted uncomfortably, his excuse unraveling as quickly as his confidence. The officers, realizing they had been drawn into a personal agenda, apologized in their own quiet way by lowering their tone and stepping back. My son, still shaken, finally found his voice and asked if he had done anything wrong. I knelt beside him, telling him the truth he hadn't. None of this was his fault. The SEAL stayed calm, explaining to the officers that their presence in our home wasn't a coincidence but a simple family visit, nothing close to the suspicion that had been painted. Their calm authority seemed to settle the room. The whole president, red-faced and cornered, muttered something about miscommunication before quickly retreating. It was clear his attempt to intimidate us had failed, and the truth had left him exposed. When the police finally left, the house grew quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This time, it carried a sense of relief and also awareness. My son leaned against me, and I could feel the weight lift off his shoulders. He had seen how quickly people could twist stories, but he had also witnessed calm strength in the face of pressure. The SEALs later told me that situations like this were reminders of why trust and vigilance mattered. It wasn't just about rules or authority, it was about standing steady when others tried to push you down. As I tucked my son in that night, I reminded him of the most important part. No matter how loud the outside voices get, truth and resilience will always speak louder. And that was the real victory we carried forward.